great students. I know you guys are really great students. So like I said, on the top left, we've got the area for questions. And the top right, we've got the area to just talk to each other, talk about what Dr. Malkus is talking about. You guys know the drill. So we also want to explain a little bit about how the format for tonight is. So we've got 40 minutes of Dr. Malkus talking about the policy resolution. And then we also have 20 minutes afterwards for a Q&A session. You can either give your questions, ask your questions, able to devote all of his time and attention to those. So now, just to introduce Dr. Malkus himself, Dr. Nat Malkus is a resident scholar and he's the Deputy Director of the Education Policy at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI for short. He specializes in K-12 education there. He specifically works on applying quantitative data to education policy, and his work focuses on school finance, charter schools, school choice, and the future of standardized testing. He has a PhD in education policy and leadership from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a BA in historical studies from Covenant College. So he is definitely the most qualified to talk to you guys about this topic on education policy. And I'm going to go ahead and let him take it away. He can go ahead and start, and I will be seeing you guys again at the very end of the webinar for a quick survey.
Hi, I'm Nat Malkus. It's nice to be with you tonight. I trust everyone can hear me, and if you can't, let me know in one of the text boxes. So tonight I'm going to talk about the federal role in financing and regulating elementary and secondary education. Like Maddie said, I'm the Deputy Director here at Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. My approach tonight is not to convince, but to sort of give you the lay of the land and hopefully some perspective that will help in formulating, understanding, and anticipating arguments about whether to increase or decrease the federal role in U.S. education. So tonight on the webinar, I'm sort of have the layout. First, I just want to kind of go over the basic structure of U.S. education finance and regulation. I'm going to sort of start out sort of at a point of stasis right around the year 2000 and lay out sort of where things were. It's going to be oversimplified for reasons that I'm going to explain. And then I'm going to go into a sort of a recent history. So basically since 2000, the history of the federal role. And there's been a lot of action in the past 16 or 17 years, up and down. And I'm going to focus sort of on the interplay of funding and regulation. So I could have focused one or the other, but actually they work in tandem with each other. And there's sort of a push and pull that's sort of important to understand. And then we'll kind of get into questions about the pluses and minuses of increasing the federal role. And I have sort of three questions that I would suggest you orient your thinking about. Put it into concrete terms. So when you say, well, the federal role in regulation or funding needs to be increased, to what purpose? To what end do you think that change should happen? And whatever that aim is, whatever that problem definition step that you have, consider before you go all in and say, yes, the federal role is appropriate or not, what really is the right level of government? And in American education, that's a particular salient question. And then finally, even if you're still convinced one way or the other, it's important to think through the consequences of federal action, of increasing the role, and at the same time of inaction. So the basic structure of U.S. education is still the same, although it's gone through some shifts over the past 20 years that are notable. Prior to that, first of all, it's important to realize we have a Federalist education system. And what that means is that it is literally state-led. States have the constitutional responsibility to provide education to their residents, and the federal government does not. There's a court case, Supreme Court in 1973, the Rodriguez case, that was sort of the linchpin on this. It was a 5-4 decision that essentially ruled that there is no federal right to education and that it is a state role under the Constitution. That's still being debated whether that was right, and it's important to recognize that one justice is the key tipping point in that momentous decision. And then we've had some traditional regulatory roles that sort of filter down from that. There's sort of a subsidiarity here, where the federal government has typically played a supplementary and relatively small role. This was definitely the case in the years before 2001. And states actually played a relatively supplementary role as well. It was the local school boards and school districts that took the primary responsibility from the states, in every state except Hawaii, which is a single district. And those districts had the primary role both to raise funding and to regulate, decide what was to be taught, how things were to be run, who went to what schools. States had a fairly small role. Early in the 20th century, that local role was overwhelmingly dominant in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and the state role increased over time. Part of this is that state role and the evolution really comes from the financing system. So local districts finance education primarily through property taxes. This is pretty important because if you live in an area that has a lot of high property values, an urban city or a suburban area that has high value properties, well, it's actually pretty easy to raise money because you just have a big tax base. And so you can even have relatively low taxes and still have plenty of money to run an education system. If you have a poor property tax base, you just don't have that much property wealth, then you either need high taxes or you have to go with a relatively lowly funded education system. And this sort of grates against notions of fairness and equity for people who are living in these poor or wealthy or more or less advantaged areas. So states had an increasing role through lawsuits and different funding strategies to actually supplement those. And they would take state dollars, primarily gained, and this differs across the states, by income and sales taxes, and use a much smaller proportion of those, but they would send money to districts, and still do, and they tend to send more money to less wealthy districts to supplement their ability to fund education, and then wealthier districts tend to get less funding. That is sort of an oversimplification, but that has been sort of the state role. And then the federal government, of course, gets primarily funded through income taxes and has supplemented particular needs. So if we look here, let's see if I can get these controls straight. We can see sort of how this funding works out. Now I'm going to take you through a couple of these graphs so you can see important ways to use evidence in these debates. These are billions of dollars in revenue for the nation as a whole spent on K-12 education from 1992 to 2014. And so the first thing that you can notice is that the local share is large. It's about 45% throughout this period. The state share is about equal. Again, this is average, so it differs for some states than others. And then across the board, the federal share is actually pretty small, at about 10%. So you have a 45%, 45%, 10% cut, and the federal role is, pretty small. Now, one thing that's important to do, you can look at these numbers, and if you want to talk about the historical changes in funding, an important thing to realize is that these are real dollars. So why it says, or these are not real dollars, these are nominal dollars. So where it says about $275 billion in 1992 was spent on education, that's 1992 dollars, not adjusted for inflation. So if we look at the next thing, we can see that the growth gets much smaller when you actually use real dollars. So here, we just adjusted those 1992 dollars to be at their equal value in 2016. And across the board, they're all adjusted so that, it's apples to apples. So what we see is that the increase in funding is actually not as great as it appears to be with nominal dollars because we're using 2016 dollars, but the relative shares stay the same. Of course, that doesn't tell the whole story because that's just overall spending. And usually it's better to look at per pupil dollars to figure out where those changes go. And so right here, we're looking at real dollar changes from about 400 to 600 and change $billion over this time period. But when you adjust it for per pupil amounts, you can see that the change is actually from about $9,600 to a little over 12. So we're talking in the first, it looked like the funding doubled. In the second, it looked like it went up by a third. Here we're saying, well, it looks like it went up by a sixth. This is important for a number of reasons. We can see that overall expenditures have increased, that the shares have remained relatively consistent over time, but that the increase in real dollars per pupil is not as great as you might expect. A couple other things to notice here. What happened in about 2007, 2008, the Great Recession. You can see that funding for education sort of plateaued and then dipped. This is sort of the first time, if you go way, way back on that axis, or that way, if in the orientation of this camera. And so there has been growth and there has been this dip. There's also a marked increase there from about 2009 to 2011 in federal dollars. That was primarily one-time stimulus response. So that was raised to the top and other stimulus dollars that the federal government put in to combat the recession. So that gives you a little sort of lay of the land in understanding how finance has increased. Now, one thing I want to do is we look at that increase. I want to implore you to beware of oversimplification of these numbers. So this is a chart that I've seen sometimes, and what you see here is the blue line is this estimated, on average across the nation, an inflation-adjusted per pupil cost of their entire education for K through 12. And you see it's gone up a bunch. It's gone up almost 100% since 1970. That's a big increase. And then these lines at the bottom are test scores, and you see they've been relatively flat. And so some folks will say, hey, more money is just totally wasted. There's no reason to put it in. And I want to caution you against oversimplifying these things. The increases that we see, some of it is certainly inefficiency. It can be argued that it's wasteful. However, schools do a lot more now than they did in 1970. Today, schools provide a great deal more education for special education students, more specialized care, more services for English language learners, more wraparound services, a lot of expensive things that we hung on our schools that we've asked them to do. Administration costs have also gone up, but you can't say that the increase in that spending was primarily focused on increasing students' scores. And so the lack of a relationship there, I think you need to be careful when you're looking around to do research on this stuff to interpret simplified graphs as if they should be, well, every dollar we spend should increase some percentage of the student scores. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the federal role. Again, before No Child Left Behind, pre-2001, the federal government's primary role, they had a bunch of smaller programs, but the big two were Title I, which is dollars for poor students in concentrated poverty areas, and IDEA, which is the special education funds from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And those were the two big buckets of spending. And there were a lot of rules about who could use the money and how, but there wasn't much accountability to it. So in 2001, the Bush administration, oh, my lights have gone out, but that's the cost of staying late, I suppose. In 2001, the Bush administration passed or signed No Child Left Behind into the law. And part of the logic behind this law was, wow, we have been spending a lot of money from the federal government, and we don't know what we're getting for it. So we need some accountability. If states are going to take these dollars, if localities are going to use these dollars, we're going to have to make sure that they become increasingly focused on getting students the outcomes that we need. And so they put a lot of federal pressure. They instituted requirements for every state to develop and test every student in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. They had requirements on teacher quality and qualifications, on persistently failing schools and what states had to do to turn around schools that are low performing for year after year. And how do we assess those schools? Well, we use those test scores that we mentioned earlier. There's sort of a whole raft of things that came with No Child Left Behind. And a lot of people had complained about it, that it was what they called an unfunded mandate. So on one logic, the logic of No Child Left Behind was, well, we've been giving you money. We continue to give you money. We have not been asking you for these accountability measures. So you've always been getting the money, and now we're bringing on some accountability. And a lot of the folks that sort of pushed back against this have said, well, yeah, but we were working hard, and then you increased these requirements, a bunch of requirements, and didn't give us funding, so it actually may have reduced our capacity. There's arguments both ways. One of the things that No Child Left Behind did was it set up some ostentatiously high or ridiculously high targets. So it said, states can come up with their tests, but they have to define what proficiency is in their state. So we give the state some flexibility, but you have to tell us what percentage of your students are proficient. And the goal was, by 2014, everyone in the state had to be proficient, 100%. Well, history of education should teach us that getting everyone above a relatively high standard is difficult to do at best. And I think a lot of the logic in the law was that it would be sort of reauthorized, and some of those really punitive problems would be legislated away. Of course, hindsight is 2020. Congress was not very responsive. And in the Obama administration, a lot of these schools in the nation, a lot of schools that folks thought, well, these aren't bad schools, were getting caught up in these No Child Left Behind consequences. They were being labeled as failing for what some people thought were inadequate reasons. And so the Obama Department of Education and the Obama administration was frustrated and thought that we needed to do something for states. States were complaining. Congress was inactive. So they set up this way to give waivers to states, saying, well, you don't actually have to follow No Child Left Behind waivers because the Department of Education is the regulatory body in charge of it. Now, they saw this as a great opportunity to actually get a lot of their favored policies implemented. And so they said, we will give you a waiver, but there's a quid pro quo here. And the quid pro quo is that if you apply for the waiver and you institute data systems and you change your tests and you introduce new standards for your education system and a list of other things, well, then you're more likely to get these waivers. And by doing that, it negotiated a lot of states into doing a bunch of things at once that they probably otherwise would not have done. So another thing happened in the Obama administration, that was the Great Recession. And as I mentioned before, the response by the federal government was to put stimulus money out and to get it into the economy quickly, and state education funds were lower. So the Obama administration said, well, we need to invest in schools, and at the same time, we will invest, but we will give them incentives, again, to do what the federal government thinks that we should do. So these were things, again, like many of the things that you heard about in the No Child Left Behind waivers. Why don't you update your standards? This became a lot of the wind in the sails of what became to be the Common Core state standards, which spread to 44 states. And you might have heard about, they became somewhat controversial. A whole raft of new assessments that came with the Common Core standards. The additional use of test student test scores to evaluate teachers, and a number of things that had to be implemented, not only at all, but many of them at the same time. So there was a lot of impetus from the federal government, not by forcing states, but through incentives to do what the federal government thought best. Many of these might have been great ideas. All of them at once came because all of them at once were sort of particularly difficult to pull off. And again, while the Race to the Top did come with funding, the No Child Left Behind waivers did not. So depending on which parts you're talking about, the regulation had increased over time, again, sort of based on this No Child Left Behind logic that the federal government is investing and now we need some accountability. So in 2015, towards the end of the Obama administration, a new law was passed that reauthorized No Child Left Behind, and this is called the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. President Obama referred to it as a Christmas miracle in December of 2015, in large part because Congress was not particularly productive and was sort of deadlocked. But a lot of the states were still suffering from not only the No Child Left Behind consequences, but also from the pressure that came from the No Child Left Behind waivers and the Race to the Top, and these pushes from the federal government through incentives, not through laws, that a lot of states were really frustrated with it. A lot of Republicans were howling about the Obama administration's overreach into education, again in a federalist system, particularly a concern for conservatives. They said, this is federal overreach. The federal overreach, not only through and even worse, not through the legislature, but through the administration. So the passage of ESSA really dialed back a lot of the pressures from No Child Left Behind and pressures from the Obama administration's work through Race to the Top and the waivers to No Child Left Behind. And it focused on returning authority to the states. The states received this authority, and a lot of the intent to push back that authority came from repeatedly in the law. It said the secretary, meaning the Secretary of Education, shall not. Usually it says the secretary shall, but this time it's shall not do this and shall not do that. So some of the takeaways from this history is, first, to understand the federal role is really just coming off an apex, right? We are just since 2015, are peeling back some of this federal role. And you should also notice that the funding and the regulation, which were once upon a time were fairly loosely connected, are now much more enmeshed. And the federal regulation that had come up was tied to more or less static funding. The federal role also grows the state's role. So prior to No Child Left Behind, locals were really in primary control in most states. Now the pendulum swung towards the federal government and the state, and now it is centered much more with the state. So the state is still more powerful than it was in most cases. Another thing just to notice about this is that regulatory creep can be really natural, right? So you can find that the federal government, as it increases its power, it doesn't say, oh, well, this is good. We're good here. We're satisfied. Typically in the long term, you get regulatory creep that continues. And that's something to be watchful for. Okay, so now we're getting sort of back to the key phrase here. The United States federal government should substantially increase its funding and or regulation of pre-K through grade 12 education in the U.S. And so again, I'm going to go through these sort of 3 points. What's the thing I want to push you to do is get concrete, because to just say, well, the federal government should spend more money is not a very astute statement. I would say that you'd need to say, to what end? What purpose is the proposed change in the federal government's role? And also, what is the benefit of stasis? A second question, what is the right level of government if you're looking to change for a given purpose? And what are the consequences of action or inaction on those points. Let me just put another sort of pin in the idea that this government policy can be a blunt tool, particularly the further removed you are from the implementation of a given policy on the ground. So this is certainly the case when you have 100,000 public schools across the nation. The question should be, well, should it be the local district that makes consequential decisions? Should it be the state capital? Can the Department of Education over here in Washington, D.C. on Maryland Avenue, can they really be expected to effectively achieve the purposes, however well-intentioned, that they seek to? So what's the purpose of the proposed change? And I would say that it's important to define why you think the federal government should increase. Again, most funding comes from states and local authorities. I'll talk a little bit about that subsidiarity a bit more in a moment. But there are some good reasons to think, well, maybe there are investments that are worthwhile. So you could say, well, we need more pre-kindergarten. We have almost universal K across the states, but we know that early childhood learning can greatly affect later outcomes, particularly for disadvantaged students. So the bang for your buck might be the highest with pre-K. So, perhaps we have an insufficient pre-K, and perhaps we want to increase it. You can think through a number of other things here. Career and technical education, for a long period, we've focused on this sort of college for all idea, that students going through high school just need to go to college. It fits for everyone. And that's increasingly being peeled back. Career and technical education may need some investments. Okay. Another one is to improve teacher quality, right? We know that teachers can be the most important school-based input for student learning. So maybe we need to invest in the quality of our teachers. We need to pay them more, give higher tests, forgive their loans, their student loans. There's a number of ways to approach that. So, that could be a reasonable purpose. Another one is persistently failing schools. There are schools that fail students, a lot of students, and fail to graduate, high percentages of students. And they don't do this for 1 year. They'll do it for year after year after year. They'll do it for an entire academic generation of students, But the time it takes one student to go K through 12, that school will continue to fail students throughout. So, yeah, maybe we have some serious purposes, some serious things that need addressing. Well, then the question needs to become, well, what's the right level of government to address that? And there's an even better way to ask that question. It's not who can do it, but who can do this well. So this is a key argument that I think you need to deal with when you talk about increasing the federal role. Who can make change in schools and do it effectively, do it well? So subsidiarity is this idea that the federal government actually doesn't devolve power over education to states, because we have a federalist system where states have the role to provide education. But it sort of acts like that because it uses this power of the purse of its 10% that it contributes. It says, well, if you want to do these, if you want to keep getting this money, you need to perform to our specifications. And so it's actually has a lot of shaping effect. And then, of course, particularly in the 20th century, states gave a lot of the authority to locals and said, well, you local governments, you should be in charge because you know what kids should learn. You know your communities on the ground. We're going to trust you to make good decisions. And, of course, those locals, they are nearest. Now, part of that, that works very well as long as you can trust all local districts to invest enough money, to do enough quality control, to make sure that all students, poor students, immigrant students, minority students, are given not only the same amount of resources, but adequate resources, and these don't always play out. So there's some tug and toll with subsidiarity, but it's important to realize that you can also have some problems. So a quick couple of examples. I won't go through all these. I'll just go through the Common Core Testing Consortia, because it's a great example of how pushing too hard from on high can actually backfire. So with the Race to the Top grants and No Child Left Behind waivers, part of the changes that were incentivized were, well, you should come up with new standards. And those new standards, well, if you're going to come up with new standards and you have to do tests, you need to change the tests. So what the federal government did was it sponsored these two things and said, okay, states, you just get together, we'll give you a big bunch of money, and you come up with a couple of tests that you'll share together. And so they came up with two consortia tests that were Common Core aligned. They were going to be better tests than ever. They were going to be cheaper because a bunch of states were putting it together. It's a great idea. Really, great idea, lots of good reasons to do this. So what happened in the downflow of these good intentions, unfortunately, was Common Core became a politically charged hot potato. And these tests that were adopted, they were fairly good tests. You could bicker about them, but it wasn't as much quality as it was a big deal to get rid of your standards and restructure your whole education system. But it wasn't that big of a deal comparatively to get rid of the tests. So people said in a number of states, well, we hate the Common Core, but we can't get rid of the Common Core because that's a big deal, but we can get rid of these tests. So there are a bunch of states that, even though they're supposed to be marking their students' progress and their schools' progress with these tests, they've changed the tests, some of them more than once. Missouri had 4 tests in 4 years. It's pretty hard to track your scores when you change the tests 4 years in a row. So, this is one of those things where a great idea on high doesn't necessarily get the buy-in and implementation at the local level, and in a federalist education system, you can really be set back. Another thing just to be measured on all these things that I want you to be aware of, or at least be wary of, is the idea of what's measured gets managed. So one of the big complaints that's really happened since No Child Left Behind is we just focus too much on tests. Now, tests are useful. There's no doubt about it. I think tests are very useful. I think well done, they can help us make sure that we're reaching high levels of achievement, that we're not leaving some students behind, and that we're assessing what kids really need to know. However, when you put a lot of importance in a system on reading and math scores, then you're going to get a system that focuses on reading and math scores. There's a number of other aspects of learning that may get short shrift, that may slyly be just shortchanged, and it's a concern. So again, when I say what is the right level of government, it's important also to be sure that what we want to improve doesn't necessarily displace a number of other important things. So this is where we sort of, this is sort of a transition to what is the consequences of action, and I think it's important also to say inaction. The Common Core and a couple of those other things, and if you're particularly interested in one of these two, what are the other two that I had here? Teacher evaluation or school improvement grants. If you're interested in those, we can talk about them maybe in the Q&A. But those unintended consequences are more likely the more distance you have, right? So what are the consequences? Well, I think about this as the game of telephone, right? You did this in grade school, I'm sure, where the first person in the class whispered to the second person a sentence, and you went around the room, and by the time you got to the other side, I took my dog for a walk, turns into the car went to the moon. It doesn't make sense. Those translation problems are definitely what can happen when the federal government tells states what to do and the states tell districts what to do, particularly when the states don't necessarily want to do what the federal government wants them to do, and when the local districts don't necessarily want to do what the states want them to do or what the federal government wants to do. So action has some unintended consequences, and it's important to look to those. On the flip side, you can argue it the other way, that inaction has actually some pretty predictable and very undesirable consequences. So there's some stark problems and realities in our education system. We do have achievement gaps that have been going on for a long time, and that any political persuasion or any reasonable person should not be happy with. So poor people just do worse in our education system and benefit less from it than wealthier people. Minorities, Black, Hispanic, American Indian students tend to do much worse than white students. Regularly, Asian students tend to do better, and of course those are sort of gross race groups, but those achievement gaps, by most perspectives, are unacceptable, and we need to do something about them. Doing nothing or just trusting that all localities will effectively address them is not necessarily a wise path. There's also just underpreparedness. Our school system, even despite the inequality, may just not be that effective compared to what we need to do. If we want to be competitive in a 21st century economy, it may be that we need to increase our education system's demand and productivity to keep up with the knowledge economy. And then there's just structural inequalities. So this has less to do with achievement gaps and more to do with sort of the reproduction of economic inequality that can happen that are sort of based on those achievement gaps. But I'm talking less about differences in test scores, which are important, but they're only so important. It's probably much more important that lifetime earnings differ, graduation, entry to and graduation from college differ, your likelihood of sort of getting married differs. These education attainment things are associated with everything from your likelihood to be obese, to your likelihood to be happy, married, not be divorced later in life. So the downflow of an ineffective education system deserves attention. So just being inactive is not necessarily any better than trying to be prudent and do nothing. So this sort of returns us to this question, right? The United States federal government should substantially increase its funding and or regulation of pre-K-12 education in the United States. I think one could argue either side of this, right? We've seen some examples, I've touched them briefly on some problems that have come from federal intervention. I don't know about federal funding, but it certainly tends to bring regulation with it. That needs to be carefully dealt with. On the other hand, inaction has problems as well. So I'd encourage you, when you argue either side, to argue it in the context of the facts on the ground and concretely. That think about what you believe the education system should do and try and match your solution to the problems that you've defined. Not just say that money will solve a bunch of problems. There's a whole other debate about whether just adding money solves problems. I think I'm not going to get into that here. The large part is, well, just sending more money can actually not be that effective. And so it's important how we do things. So it's important to be concrete and not just say, well, more money will increase test scores and give us everything that we want. There is a zero-sum game there with the federal budget and that we have. And especially the fact that if we increase the federal budget, you have to spread it across 100,000 different schools. So if you spend an extra $1 million, you just gave every school $10. It's not going to get you very far. And then finally, just avoid the naivete that comes with simple ideas like, well, if we don't spend enough money, so if we just increase the federal share by 100%, we get a 10% increase in spending, and we'd be in Shangri-La. Those arguments are foolish and destined not only to debate to not get you very far, but they are going to run into bad politics and bad policy. So you could argue either side. You guys are the debaters. So I'd encourage you to make some quality arguments. I got about 17 minutes, 15 minutes. I'm happy to go over anything, answer some questions. Let me know what you think. Okay, so Joseph has this question: what's a good way to measure student success? That's a good question. It's certainly unsettled. The knee-jerk reaction is, well, let's look to student test scores. So let's talk about test scores for a minute. Test scores are a good proxy for, or a good sort of way to view how the education system is performing. And high test scores sort of are correlated to lots of good things: higher salaries, higher earning potential. Like I said, lower likelihood to be obese, to die early, to be addicted to drugs, to just a wide variety of sort of surprising things. You can actually be skinnier on average if you get more education. I don't know if that's a causal relationship, but it's there. Now, how do we measure those things at the school level is a very tricky question. You can just say, well, what's the average test score in the school for 8th graders? That's what I want to know. Then I'll know how good this school is. Well, then you may find out about how good the school is. You might actually find out that the kids that end up going to that school are just wealthier, and so they're more likely to do better on tests to begin with. You could find, in fact, if you just look at the average test score in a school, that those schools are getting better students to start with, even though they're not moving them further down the field. So for a lot of reasons, we want to use what's called value-added scores, and that sort of tries to measure through some statistical magic, which is arguable, but well-intentioned, to figure out how much progress we've made. So you could think about absolute scores or progress. You can also think about other ways to measure student readiness for college or careers. We do that through test scores. You can also just look, if you have the data, at how many students are employed down the line, how many go to college, how many finish college on time. You can also look at sort of how well a high school performs by how many of their students they manage to graduate. It's important to keep your eye on the fact that a lot of these things that we're talking about, if you put up the pie chart where you just look at how much of the variation, the pie chart with my face in it, how much of the variation in student performance is due to different things, well, that's where things sort of get tricky, right? Do we think it all has to do with the school? We know it doesn't. Lots of family characteristics go into that, a lot of things that schools can't control. And so it's important to associate differences in student outcomes with the things that schools do and the things that schools are either unable to do or are not intended to do. I hope that gets at your question. Dalton says, what is my opinion on the possibility of educational field trips to alleviate the issues seen in our education system? That is interesting. There's a guy, Jay Green, down at the University of Arkansas who's done some work on field trips, and he has found, he just came out with another paper the other day, found that plays that students attend, live plays, can, at least in this experimental setup, actually cause higher levels of sort of pro-social behavior and empathetic thinking and also reasoning about the play for students who go to them. Students who just stayed in school scored lower on these measures, and students who actually went to a movie, which was not a live performance, didn't do any better either. So he also has some other things where he's explored whether going to art museums can help. And I think those are important things. Let's think about what they do. I think field trips can expose students, particularly disadvantaged students, to experiences they might not otherwise have. There's a lot to be said about that. The question is, if we engage in these activities, what are we replacing when we do that? So for some students, we're replacing seat time in school. And we have some that can be spent to that, but how much is wise is an important question. And if we're spending some money that we otherwise would not spend on those things, what is the best opportunity cost for that money? Those are good questions. Now, you ask a particular form of this question, which was not, are they valuable, but what's the possibility that they could alleviate the issues? Again, I'm going to push you to get specific what issues you're talking about. I think it can close some opportunity gaps. It can open up some opportunities, particularly for students who are not exposed to certain educational field trips. Are they going to solve the major problems in our system? Maybe not. Or do they help us sort of keep the focus on what the central purposes of education are, other than sort of narrow reading and math scores that we so often focus on? They certainly could. Do I think the education system needs further regulation in order to achieve better student results? If I knew what the education system needed, I would be hammering away at it. And I have some ideas on things that can improve. The question is, what do you mean by regulation? So if it is, well, the federal government could institute a couple of regulations that's going to fix things across the land, I think that is a pretty tall order. I think that the federal government has limited ability to identify one simple problem across our entire nation that will really help alleviate the problems in our schools, because I don't think it's a problem. I think there are problems. So I also think, I've told you about this sort of problem and how things get changed as they roll down from the federal level all the way down to, 100,000 schools. So I think that those things are tricky. That said, I don't think the federal government is incapable of helping. I think that the best thing to do, however, is to tread carefully, look to increase the capacity of local schools to do good things and to deliver on promises, to do research on what is working in other places and share that, and the government does do that, and I think it should continue to. And I think it should try and empower states, which are a little closer to the problem, to sort of roll down their capacity. We've made a big bet here with ESSA. Really, we have swung back some of the federal authority to the states, and that is a good thing in my mind. But it does assume that states have the ability to look at the problems that they see in their state and effectively remediate them. I'm just not sure that all states have the capacity to really fix their schools. That doesn't mean the federal government does, but it raises the question of, if not them, and maybe some states aren't capable of doing it, who's going to rise to the challenge? Let's see. Joseph said, should local governments have any stake in education reform? Not exactly sure what you mean, Joseph, so if you want to rephrase that, that might get me a little closer to it. I mean, they definitely have a stake in it. Local governments spend, their first line item in their budgets almost across the board is education. They also directly run it. Schools are often the largest employer of local governments, or the largest employment sector in local governments. It's a big issue in elections. If they don't have a stake in it, I think, or if somehow the local stake was tried to be removed, I think we'd need a revolution, not a reform, to do that. So I see you're typing here. Yeah, again, should local governments, they do. We get to a capacity issue here, right? So you can have a lot of experimentation and so forth, but if you look over local governments, there's a question about whether they have the expertise, right? So I think local governments have the ability to sort of demand that experts get results, and that they can carefully they can do well by carefully demanding that we bring in people with the expertise to effectively educate students, whether they all have the capacity to get the results that we need and ask of complicated education systems is a tough question. I mean, I think there's a bunch of local governments who underfund education and would do far better to pay more in taxes and invest more in their students. So now, as far as what the effects of that are, if the states come in and add regulations on top of them, again, I see that there's serious problems that can result in that. There are ways where top-down reforms can actually send us backwards. They can tie the hands of locals. They can increase sort of red tape. They can increase the requirements of what people have to do. I'll give you a quick just explanation of this quandary. Something I'm interested in. There's a big problem with suspensions, the federal government is upset about suspensions, overall suspensions also, race differences in suspensions, and sort of the current reform idea is restorative justice. This is where instead of suspending kids, we have these restorative justice meetings or restorative circles where you have a bunch of students and some teachers sort of talk through issues that arise. There's a lot to like about this. I really think it can have some positives. The question is that when we say, well, you know, now the state of Maryland is going to do restorative justice, and then you ask these schools across the state to institute these programs that they don't really understand, and you don't give them the additional resources to do what you're asking them to do, then you're actually saying, well, I want you to spend more time sitting in seats talking with more people about behavior and about the rules and the relationships in the classroom. Well, it can be a zero-sum game if you don't put more capacity in there for them to manage these systems. And so what you're actually doing is you're saying, let's spend more of students' time and teachers' time, an unknown amount, on these restorative justice practices and pull them away from other things. Again, a well-intentioned reform. Do I think it can be problematic? I'm worried about that one and how well it's going to be implemented. Anyone else? I can wait you out. I know your names. Eric Johnson, you must have a question. You're right there in the participants list. Kimberly? Lauren? Anyone? You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
In that case, thank you so much, Nat, for speaking to us. I know I learned a lot. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to help us out and to help us learn a little bit more about the United States education system. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and flip to the survey screen. So all the participants, if you just want to go ahead and fill this out to the best of your ability, just give us your opinions. And